Revolutions Per Minute is a weekly radio show from the New York City chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, recorded live at WBAI 99.5 in Brooklyn every Wednesday at 9 p.m. RPM's about doing the work to build a democratic socialist future. Each week, hear the latest news, analysis, and organizing experience from the minds and hearts of activists fighting every day in New York City. Join the movement at socialists.nyc.
Yo, what's good, New York? This is Jack Devine, he, him pronouns, and you are listening to Revolutions Per Minute, live on WBAI 99.5 FM. We're a socialist radio show and podcast for members of the New York City Democratic Socialists of America. DSA is the largest socialist organization in the United States, with 95,000 members nationwide, and NYC DSA is its biggest chapter. We are run by our 7,000-plus members and organizers who are working together to build democratic socialism in all 5 boroughs. As our returning listeners are well aware of, there's currently an ongoing struggle for public power here in New York. Earlier today, eco-socialist organizers held a rally outside City Hall to demand the transformation of our statewide energy system necessary to avoid climate catastrophe. We'll share with you protest sounds and speeches from the action. Later in the show, I'll speak with DSA anti-imperialist organizers Olivia Katbi and Dylan Saba about the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement against Israeli apartheid. DSA supports freedom of movement and equal civil and democratic rights for all people across the world. Palestinians are no exception. We'll discuss how an anti-imperialist analysis reveals how ruling classes across the region, and especially here in the United States, profit and are empowered by the current state of affairs. International working class solidarity is the only solution. But first, the headlines.
In local news, state Democrats and unions are divided over a bill that would give gig workers collective bargaining rights, but would not allow the workers to strike, and would drop some minimum state and local protections regarding pay, paid leave, and unemployment insurance that the workers have now. Applications for the state's new emergency rental assistance program will open Tuesday, June 1st, after the first attempt at COVID rent relief proved so confusing that most of the money went unspent. Governor Cuomo made 2 picks to fill open seats on New York's Court of Appeals, ignoring more qualified candidates to appoint a political ally and career prosecutor, Madeline Cygnus. The City Council passed a bill to expand a voucher program that would enable New Yorkers experiencing homelessness to afford substantially more market-rate housing, but a last-minute change to the legislation added a glaring hole that would cut off the vouchers at just above the city's minimum wage. The U.S. Attorney's Public Corruption Office is investigating Patrick Jenkins, an influential lobbyist with close ties to Assembly Speaker Carl Heastie. Following a lawsuit from the Real Estate Board of New York, the New York Department of State has overturned its regulations banning broker's fees. New analysis shows that all New York City high schools that use screens to admit students disproportionately accept white and Asian students and reject Black and Latinx students. Unlike specialized high schools, which utilize the SAT for admittance, these high schools use a screening algorithm which uses variables like test scores, attendance, and behavioral records. In elections news, after multiple high-ranking staffers for Dianne Morales left her campaign early last week in disputes over staffer pay and mistreatment in the workplace, a number of employees on the campaign formed a union. Morales voluntarily recognized the union, but then fired 4 leaders of the unionization effort, saying the union was not inclusive of all staff and characterizing it as a, quote, coup. The firings led to a rally and work stoppage by campaign workers, leaving the campaign fractured as it heads into the final weeks before the election. The turmoil at the Morales campaign raised the issue of staff pay on all the mayoral campaigns, as well as campaign unions throughout the city. With Scott Stringer and Dianne Morales now both facing scandals, Maya Wiley is hoping to consolidate progressive support in the mayoral race. The New York Times endorsed Alvin Bragg for Manhattan DA. Tallee Weinstein raised an additional $1.5 million this filing period, mostly from her husband's finance circle. The Independent characterized the city council race between DSA candidate Michael Hollingsworth and Crystal Hudson as a battle between a leftist and the real estate industry's candidate. The State Board of Elections has finally approved software to tabulate the results of this year's ranked choice primary, but it will still likely take until mid-July until the final results are known. The latest mayoral polls show Eric Adams and Catherine Garcia moving up, as Andrew Yang slips.
Our headlines are brought to you by The Thorn, an incredible weekly newsletter by NYC DSA Electoral Working Group covering local politics and radical activism. Subscribe at thethorn.nyc. Working-class New Yorkers continue to suffer from high utility costs, massive blackouts, and deadly pollution, while the state guarantees Con Ed's capitalist executives high profit rates for building fossil fuel infrastructure. Climate catastrophe threatens us all. This morning, the NYC DSA Eco-Socialist Working Group, alongside the DSA for the City Slate, held a rally to pass public power legislation that would create democratically controlled renewable energy and 51,000 new jobs. Let's roll that clip. march in protest of hundreds of organizers demanding a just and sustainable future, the NYPD arrested a number of courageous comrades, including Revolutions Per Minute guests Gustavo and Iapa. RPM stands in solidarity with them. You are listening to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. Today, we have just been talking about the protest and rally down at City Hall for the public power legislation, and now we turn from the struggle against American ruling class profiteering from environmental destruction to the resistance against capitalist imperialism. Over the past month, the struggles by Palestinian civil society and the increasing state repression of the Israeli state in response have raised awareness of colonial repression and led to massive protests around the world. Yet the brutal conditions in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem long predate the current moment. While the corporate media in their narratives explain this as some byproduct of constant ethnic tension or competing nationalisms, the ruling classes of the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia all continue to reap the rewards of imperial oppression. Instead of following the discourse, Olivia Katbi Smith and Dylan Saba joined me to follow the profits of arms manufacturers and to discuss the international working class solidarity of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement. Let's go to that interview right now.
So I am here with Olivia and Dylan, and we are going to be discussing the BDS campaign and the kind of the struggle for Palestinian liberation. But before we do that, I just want to direct this question to both of you. It's something we always like to discuss on our show is, like, what social forces propelled you into the socialist movement? Why did you join DSA in particular? And what sort of organizing work have you been involved with? And Olivia, let me throw that to you first.
Yeah. So I grew up half Arab in rural Ohio, which is a lonely place to be Arab. And the first protest I ever went to was a protest for Palestine in the summer of 2014 in Chicago during the bombing campaign of Gaza that summer. And from there, just really started paying more attention to Palestine. And I knew that Democrats were really bad on the issue, but I thought, that's just what we have. And then Bernie Sanders came along and said he was a democratic socialist, and he had been independent of the Democrats his whole political career. And so that sort of brought me to the realization not only was there possibility beyond the two-party system, but also like a whole entire economic system, a possibility beyond capitalism. And so I joined the Democratic Socialists of America because he said he was a democratic socialist. And one of the first things I did when I joined DSA was join a caucus that was pushing the national organization to endorse the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, which we did at our 2017 national convention. And then, I served as co-chair of the Portland chapter of DSA, Portland, Oregon, where I am, for 3 years up until this March was when my term ended. And I've been involved in labor organizing in Portland, anti-fascist work, and of course, Palestine and anti-imperialist work, both in Portland and on a national level in DSA.
It's always so fascinating to hear how, like, being involved in a particular moment of struggle, like this protest for Palestinian liberation that you were involved in 2014, can kind of be like a spark that eventually leads you into movement organizing, and that there's how all these various particular struggles can lead to socialist organization.
Yeah, so not a dissimilar story. I grew up in the East Bay. Into a family that's progressive, and a lot of my earliest political memories are being brought to anti-war protests. It was a big deal that Barbara Lee, my congressional representative, was the lone voice opposing the AUMF, the piece of legislation giving the Bush administration kind of a blank check to launch whatever kind of war they wanted at Afghanistan. But I never really considered myself a radical until I went to college and linked up with some Palestinians there and started organizing around the issue of Palestine and was just sort of shocked at the vitriol that I received in opposition. And at that point I kind of realized that positions that I thought might be self-evident or just a part of a larger progressive current were viewed as a threat to some larger structures. So that kind of led me along that into reading texts like Fanon and Mao and stuff, coming from this sort of Palestine national liberatory angle, and was only really brought to this sort of more traditional Marxist canon because that's what my political allies were reading. We're reading Marx and Lenin, etc. So that's kind of was my entry point into the socialist or the communist left, and I still kind of view myself as in the sort of investigation period of my life. I'm an attorney. I spent a lot of years in school, and I'm only sort of just now starting to engage with class struggles on the ground. I'm an eviction defense attorney currently, and I chose to do that in order to get as close as I could to the side of class struggle itself. But doing so, I felt pretty compelled to engage with more structures of leftist organizing. So I mean the reason I joined DSA is because that's where the leftists are primarily, and so that's that felt like the obvious way to tap in, and I'm that it's been sort of a slow entry for me over the course of a couple of years, and I'm really grateful to you, Jack, and other comrades that have facilitated that for me, and I've been able in addition to Palestine organizing, which I've been doing for quite a number of years, to tap into some projects such as the Red Wave Collective, some housing organizing work, and other projects in New York City.
Well, Dylan, we're very happy to have you helping out with Red Wave and the fight for WBAI, and to make it the sort of working class media institution that it has the potential to be. And I think you hit on a couple crucial notes in that story, in the sense that just by even just having a basic commitment to fight for human decency and dignity for all people leads you to a radicalizing space, because people start to oppose you over what seems to be the common sense and normal solution to guarantee people all basic democratic and civil rights. And then also engaging in eviction defense kind of leads you inevitably to if you're committed to that fully, into class struggle organizations, because that's the only way to actually fight back against power of landlords and the state, particularly here in New York, where they've had immense power for a very long time. And so let's kind of transition into what we're hoping to talk about today. And both of you have already hit on this as being really crucial to your political development. But I think it's important to kind of foreground this conversation about BDS with a kind of historical background. So let me throw this to you, Dylan, first, and then Olivia, feel free to add on anything that you want. In what ways does this represent a continuation of settler practices?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a very important question, but I kind of want to premise it just by offering the idea that there's kind of a limit of the utility in trying to trace back a single line of like proximate causes for that led up to to the events of the past month or so. And the reason I say that is not to avoid the question of what the current conjecture is, but just to preemptively resist the framing of this issue as a dormant conflict that that has its flare-ups where things are cold for a while and then they heat up, because that's just really not the reality of Zionism, and it's not the reality of Palestine. It's kind of always hot in Palestine. The processes of dispossession are slow, but they are constantly ongoing. And that means the siege of Gaza. It means the dispossession of families in 48 Israel, and particularly in Jerusalem over the course of many decades, and it sometimes is informed, sanctioned by the legal institutions of the State of Israel, and it's sometimes extrajudicially. But we could talk about a number of things that are kind of contributing to what's happening now. We could talk about the particular political pressure that Benjamin Netanyahu has been facing, given his legal troubles and his tenuous hold on political power in Israel, which apparently is waning quite rapidly and may be over. There is the particular case of families in Sheikh Jarrah and the struggle against state-sanctioned dispossession that they're facing, as well as other neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and so on, etc. And then there's also the case that Israel, since it began its blockade of Gaza, has pretty routinely launched wars on the territory, to do what they call mowing the lawn, which is essentially to regularly destroy the infrastructure of Gaza as a way of punishing its inhabitants for supporting the resistance against Zionism, for having elected Hamas, and also to just completely quell the possibility of resistance and to essentially beat Palestinians into submission. So a number of these things conjoined in becoming the proximate cause of the military engagement between Gaza and Israel. But I think it's really important to view this as an expression of the continuation of dispossession of Palestinian people and their land as just a fundamental component of the Zionist project that doesn't ever go cold.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as you said, it's really not an escalation of settler violence. That violence has been ongoing, but there has been an escalation of media coverage, actually, and people paying attention to this violence, in large part because of the Palestinian youth that have been organizing on the ground. There was just a historic strike in Palestine. Youth like Mohammed al-Kurd and Muna al-Kurd, whose family home is sort of at the center of this displacement crisis happening in Sheikh Jarrah, have done an incredible job elevating what's happening on the ground. And it's really created the space for, we're seeing all these celebrities, public figures, politicians, and organizations too, to feel like it's no longer scary to speak out about Palestine. It's no longer this untouchable issue. For so long, it's been so controversial to even say you support human rights for Palestinians, something that is very uncontroversial in any other context, to say you support human rights. And now, instead of being the ceiling when you talk about Palestine, it's becoming the floor. The very least you can do is say you support Palestinian human rights, which is a huge discourse shift.
Yeah, that's a really great point, on both the sense that, thinking this in terms of an escalation of settler violence, when that is constant factor, and it's more that there's been a variety of resistance and ways of challenging this settler colonial regime that have brought this to the forefront and forced a shift in the discourse, which ultimately is not enough, but kind of raises the potential for the sort of campaigns and international solidarity that is necessary to bring this apartheid regime to an end. And so kind of relatedly, when you're talking about how for so long you couldn't even mention something like human rights for Palestinians, that was too controversial. And like in kind of related to that this framework that is always pushed that, we just need peace here, which totally erases the reality of what's happening.
But before we continue on with our conversation, I just want to let our listeners know that you are tuning in to Revolutions Per Minute on listener-sponsored WBAI in New York City, broadcasting at 99.5 FM and streaming on your favorite podcast app. Today, we are talking about the struggle for Palestinian liberation and the BDS movement. And the fact that we're having this conversation on air and that you've heard this perspective and so many other perspectives from oppressed people around the world on WBA before highlights why this is a unique station compared to what you're going to hear from corporate media. And that's why we really want to urge you to support it with a $25 donation that makes you eligible for the upcoming elections. This is something that NYC DSA is currently urging on its social media. We also just want to encourage you to let you know that this means you're part of the democratic process of the station, that you can participate in the elections in this upcoming year, and that this is such a key part about what this station is about. But long term, we also want to urge you to become a sustaining member, and you can do that by becoming a WBAI buddy by going to WBAI.org. You can donate $5 a month, $10 a month, and if you do that, you'll be a sustaining member and you'll make sure to have your eligibility to participate in station elections moving forward. And now back to our conversation with Dylan and Olivia.
Why is it framing that this is like some long-standing religious and ethnic conflict between Jews and Arabs like a false narrative? And how does an anti-imperialist critique help us understand the reality of settler colonialism and apartheid in Palestine?
Yeah, like you said, framing it in that way really erases the whole power dynamic and the billions and billions of dollars at play from the United States, from weapons manufacturers, from the international community at large, who are holding up this regime of apartheid and occupation and have been aiding and abetting the violent ethnic cleansing of Palestinians since the creation of Israel. I think there's a reason why so many of us who are socialists are drawn to Palestine organizing, and that's because Palestine really gives us the clearest picture of U.S. imperialism and how U.S. foreign policy is driven by profit. The U.S. gives nearly $4 billion a year in military funding to Israel, and much of that funding is spent on purchasing weapons from U.S. weapons companies. In fact, it's actually like a clause in the MOU that the majority of Israel's military funding must be spent in the U.S. purchasing U.S.-made bombs, U.S.-made weapons, U.S.-made military equipment. And when weapons manufacturers or, these manufacturers of like the quote tactical equipment that police use, they say their products are battle tested or field tested. They're talking about Palestinians. They were tested on Palestinians, weapons, not just weapons though, but surveillance technology. Intel runs the very racist population database. All this stuff is being tested on Palestinians before being exported around the world and then brought back here to the imperial core, as we've experienced, especially during the uprisings of last summer against police violence. And that is really where we come in as socialists to make these connections, because it's not just, an issue that we should care about because we're morally on the right side. There are material connections here that we should and we can be working to break.
Yeah, completely agree with that analysis. I think I would add as well that the kind of, primordial conflict, clash of civilizations framework, is one way that the conflict is, so-called conflict is described. But I think it's worth teasing out the sort of other frameworks and their utility for various political projects. So I would say that, the notion of ancient dispute between Jews and Arabs is this kind of clash of civilizations framework is, it's useful for a fascist or a reactionary political program that's based on racial supremacy. I don't think that the majority of analysts or people would necessarily ascribe that framework in its entirety to Israel-Palestine. I think also what's dominant is a more liberal framing, which is one of competing nationalisms. So, from the historical perspective, this framework would take, the emergence of Zionism as well as the emergence of Palestinian nationalism as sort of beginning in, the post-Ottoman Empire. And that framework seeks to kind of just resolve the competing claims at nationalism in a way that's adherent to like more Wilsonian ideas about national self-determination. And that framework kind of yields itself to something like partition, where people, the various people's nationalisms are respected. And I would actually say that the fundamental contradiction of Zionism is between those two views or those two frameworks, the kind of more reactionary or fascist racial supremacy view in Clash of Civilizations and the more Wilsonian view or framework of building a national project. I would say that a left framework or a framework that's more useful towards a left political project would be one that's more rooted in post-colonialism as a mode of thinking. And that would take the idea of self-determination not to be rooted in nationalism that just sort of automatically follows from from ethnic or religious community, but would take self-determination to be literally defense against colonial or imperial aggression. So that would be, to say that, yes, Palestinian nationalism is a nationalist project, but the basis of its nationalism is not ethnic unity. It's unity in the face of colonial violence. And so ridding, ourselves, the Palestinian people, of colonial violence is, part and parcel the Palestinian national project. So I think that we see, in the discourse that these frameworks kind of bleed into each other. And I think it's important for those of us on the left to insist on a notion of self-determination that is not based in liberal conceptions of the role of the state, and to also identify that it's a resistance to dispossession that's ongoing, right? So like in a Marxist sense, what we might call primitive accumulation, the ongoing dispossession of Palestinian people is what the colonial project is doing, and that is the aspect of it that is worth resisting, and that is the proper basis for a Palestinian nationalism.
Yeah, I think that breakdown is a very useful way of kind of understanding, both the competing ideologies that kind of ultimately serve to reproduce the existence of this settled colonial project, but also by having this left critique, it reveals, in the ways that Olivia was explaining, who is funding the Israeli state. And it just so happens that it's the same state that's funding the weapon sales to Saudi Arabia, to Egypt, to various other ruling classes in the region. And once you have that understanding that it's imperialism and kind of seeing Palestine and the Palestinian people as a place where the kind of worst excesses of imperialism are brought down on a highly oppressed people, and that it is necessary if you have any commitment to democracy, even, and I think even if you don't extend it to socialism, I think it's necessary to extend it to socialism if you have a real commitment to democracy. But that if you have basic respect for the dignity and decency of these people, the imperialist critique, rather than this sort of, as you correctly assessed, this sort of Wilsonian notions of liberal democracy that won't end up liberating anyone, but will kind of only bring more conflict and create ground for which fascists can succeed, as we're seeing right now in Israel, not just within the country, but as the country is part of a broader global alliance of fascist governments around the globe, like the alliance with Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and there's a long history of that in Israel, relationships with the Latin American right-wing dictatorships that we don't have probably time to fully explore here. But I think the sort of critique that you're describing, Dylan, really gets into the kind of the basis of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So can you just explain to our listeners, what are the demands of the BDS movement? Where did the struggle for BDS first emerge, and what is the theory behind this strategy?
Sure. So I'll start us off. I think Olivia would probably be better to speak to this in detail, because she's got formal status in the BDS movement, which I'll let her speak to. But I would say, the kind of brief overview is the BDS movement was a movement launch in, I think, 2005 from a coalition of Palestinian civil society organizations. So, unions, various other associations, and nonprofits. And demands are threefold. It's an end to the occupation of all Arab territories in the region, so including the Golan Heights, the West Bank and Gaza, and a dismantling of the apartheid wall, which has been condemned by the ICJ as illegal, and which runs through Palestinian villages, separating families, etc. It also calls for full equality under the law within the 48 borders of Israel. Right now, Palestinian citizens of Israel face a number of discriminatory laws that suppress their ability to participate fully in a political sense in the state, and many of which are aimed at removing Palestinians, particularly those who live in Jerusalem, from the land. And then the final call is a recognition of the right of return. There's about 6.8 million Palestinians who live between the river and the sea, as it were, and about another 5.5 million who live external to that territory, largely in refugee camps, in large populations in Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and some other places. So those are the principal demands. The theory behind it is one of strategic nonviolence. It recognizes that the state has a monopoly on the use of violence, and that movements with lower barriers to entry are easier to build in terms of the number of participants, less likely to be dependent on foreign military support, and a tool for drawing international attention on the atrocities committed by Israel. So it's got the B, the D, and the S are sort of the three avenues of engaging with this strategy. The B being consumer boycotts, and also the cultural boycott of Israel, which targets particular companies who are participating in Israeli apartheid. The D is divestment, So that is a strategy of launching divestment campaigns in universities and unions and other institutions that invest in Israeli bonds or invest in companies that are the target of BDS. And then sanctions is a political call for governments to sanction the state of Israel until it meets the demands as they've been listed out. The other thing I would just add is that the theory of it is not an exclusive one. It's not, the idea is not that BDS is the only path, the only correct path of resistance, but it's that it's something that many people around the world can participate in.
Yeah, Dylan really covered it perfectly. But I will just add, boycotts obviously are a long-standing nonviolent tactic for civil rights movements and movements for justice historically. And, boycotts had been used in the past in Palestine and internationally in solidarity with Palestinians. But 2005, when the BDS call was issued, was really when it was first put out there as this overall strategy. This is the thing we're calling on the international community to do. Very much modeled after the South African anti-apartheid movement. And like Dylan was saying, the theory behind this strategy is that really we have to starve Israel of international support and strip it of its legitimacy in order to help, as the international community, bring an end to the regime of apartheid and occupation, similar to what happened in South Africa. Like Dylan said, of course, BDS is not the only thing it's going to take. There will also have to be mass organization inside Palestine, but it is the thing that we can do as the international committee. So more than having rallies and marches and issuing statements of solidarity, boycotting, divesting from, and sanctioning Israel is the way that anyone outside of Palestine can actually affect change. And we've already seen with hundreds of BDS victories over the years since 2005, major pension funds and churches and unions have divested. Companies have sold off their entire business in Israel. Artists and celebrities and athletes have refused to travel or perform or compete there. And now we're really getting to like the final boss stage, which is governments starting to restrict aid or condition aid and eventually strip all funding and stop all support for Israel.
Yeah, I think that's such a great way of describing it. It's a way that of a material international solidarity and pushing forward these various campaigns, and it has been a remarkable success in a lot of ways. And what you're describing in terms of the kind of organizations within Palestinian civil society, you were earlier talking about how we have seen that sort of action take place over the past few weeks with the general strike and the various other kinds of actions. So I think it kind of further building this international solidarity between these kind of various strategies and tactics is so important. And I just want to hit you, Olivia, with the final question, which is how can our listeners get involved with BDS?
Yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of BDS campaigns. As Dylan was saying, there's municipal boycott. For example, you can pressure your city to end their contract with G4S or Allied Universal. Lots of cities have security contracts with these companies. There's consumer boycott. HP and Pillsbury are both big targets of this right now. And there's also, as socialists, obviously, we believe that the work site is the center of our struggle. And that means that you can be moving BDS actions in your workplace. The San Francisco Teachers Union just became the first teachers union in the country, 6,000 teachers strong, to endorse BDS and call for an end to U.S. military funding to Israel. The LA Teachers Union just passed a BDS resolution yesterday. Block the Boat is a big action that's happening right now. Dock workers in Oakland are blocking an Israeli ship from docking there. In South Africa, they are doing the same thing. Italian dock workers just refused to unload to load weapons that were going to be shipped to Israel. These are direct actions organized collectively by workers that are so effective. And so if you, as a socialist, are looking for a way to do BDS campaigning, organizing your coworkers to take action in your workplace is the best thing you can do.
I was just going to say huge cosign, big endorsement. The prospect of furthering BDS through a labor movement in a period of regrowth is the thing about Palestine organizing that gives me the most hope and the most excitement looking towards the future. And the other thing just that I would add in addition to BDS that I think is critically important is really not to be silent on these issues. And it sounds simple, but it's really a pretty difficult ecosystem to speak out on behalf of Palestinian dignity. People face all kinds of consequences, and that's part of that's part of the strategy of Zionism in the United States is to make it very, very painful to speak out on behalf of Palestine and for Palestinian liberation. And just the more people who are willing to face that down, the less pressure there is on those who do choose to speak out.
I think that's a really great point, and we're hoping that this is helpful in that regard. Getting more and more people to connect with the kind of the strategy campaign that people are actively fighting for Palestinian liberation. And I just want to thank both of you so much for coming on Revolutions Per Minute to discuss this crucial international struggle that I think is essential to building working class solidarity around the world and in the fight against capitalist imperialism. So if you two have anything else to add, feel free to say it now.
Thanks, Jack. Appreciate it. Appreciate having us on.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having us.